Dr. Jill Schennum. Jill is an anthropologist and a professor of anthropology at County College of Morris in Randolph, New Jersey, where she teaches anthropology, cultural geography, and sociology. Her special area of research examines a topic close to the heart of this community. She has been following changes that our steelworkers experienced following the closing of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation at the turn of this last century. Her latest book, we have several copies in the back and there are some at the front desk, Goes Bethlehem, stands as one of the most comprehensive studies of the experiences of those workers who joined Bethlehem Steel while the local industry was still thriving. It was a time when unions were strong, a job was held for life, and a pension was guaranteed. So Jill has worked with steelworkers for decades, giving her a very unique glimpse and perspective into the changing nature of industrial work and how these changes have made an impact on our community. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jill Schennum.
Okay, well thank you very much, Andrea. So I'm here today just to talk about my book and the research that I've done over the past 15 years in Bethlehem. I will do that. I wanted to start off with just a few pictures of the steel mill because every time we come here we have to have a few pictures of the mill itself, which everyone from Bethlehem is of course quite familiar with. A gigantic vertically integrated steel mill that was the flagship mill for Bethlehem Steel, which as you all know was for a while the second largest steel corporation in the world. Okay, so I just want to lay out for you sort of what the structure of my book is, what it covers, how and talk a little bit about how I went about, finding out about steelworkers in their lives, and then maybe take a little bit of a deep dive into just one little piece of the book. As Andrea said, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and so therefore my approach and my method is very different than the approach and methods of many people who have written about Bethlehem Steel. Cultural anthropologists really start with people, and we start with local people, people who are living in the area, people who worked in steel, and we sort of move out from there. This work is really based on participant observation, which includes participating, observing, interviewing. I have probably interviewed about 120 steel workers all over the Lehigh Valley, up in the coal country. My research took me into people's homes all over the area because, of course, Bethlehem Steel attract labor from just a very wide area. And in addition, it's participating, it's interviewing, but also participating. So going to events, going to political protests, going to picnics, going to meetings, participating in organizations is all part of this work. And one thing that made this work really rewarding and fulfilling in the Lehigh Valley is that I think this community had such a strong interest, a shared interest in trying to understand what happened over this very long process of deindustrialization. So before I arrived in the community already had been trying to explore this question. Touchstone Theater had worked with a playwright, Allison Carey, to do a whole production, Steelbound, in which steel workers participated as this community tried to make sense out of what was happening in the community. Bruce Ward, an ex-rigger, worked to interview lots of steel workers and put together 2 documentaries in which workers were reflecting on their experiences at the steel and their experiences with deindustrialization. Frank Bam, beam yard worker, did a huge labor of love in which he went out and interviewed lots and lots of steelworkers. He published a book of those interviews, but he has so many interviews that he shared with me that are haven't been published yet as well. And then, of course, the organization I work with, the Steelworkers Archives, of which Joe Mayer, ex-steelworker, is the president, has been working tirelessly to record oral histories of steelworkers all in and around the Lehigh Valley. And again, that's a labor of love. That's an all-volunteer organization which is just incredibly committed to telling this story and figuring out what happened in this long process of deindustrialization. So, the shared interest is really important. This community, steelworkers, really wanted to understand this whole contradictory and confusing process that was so much bigger than them, but also very much involved them and impacted almost every aspect of their lives. And so I felt like I had so many colleagues in doing this work because of this shared interest and this shared participation. So, and this last piece is just, and we could maybe talk about this at the end, but I think that often anthropologists have a real commitment to what we call like public or engaged anthropology, which is continuing to work with communities around areas that are important to communities. And so with the Steelworkers Archives, for example, with NMIH, we're very committed to trying to make that history of steelworkers and diverse steelworkers be a part of the history that's told here in the community. What?
You probably have to point it closer.
That way? So the way that this was set up was that I was focusing on a 15-year cohort of steelworkers. And for those of you who know about steel and steel mills, you'll all be familiar with this, but for those who don't, steel mills tend to hire in specific years. So, and that's related to a number of different variables. Oftentimes because they do that, they have a lot of retirees at certain times that they have to replace, but also this is just sort of the ups and downs of steel demand and steel production. So at the Bethlehem mill, the three hirings that I was looking at are the early 1960s, 63, 64, 65 was a big hiring here at this mill. 73, 74 was a big hiring, and then the very last hiring of, shop floor workers was really the 78, 79 hiring. So that 15-year period, those workers that came into the plant during those three different sort of age grades were the workers that stayed at the plant through the whole long period of downsizing, disinvestment, and deindustrialization. And in my book, I really try to contrast this period when workers enter the mill in the 1960s and early 1970s with their experience of leaving the mill. And so the book is set up that way to contrast the two. And social scientists use these concepts of either like a Fordist or a post-World War II industrial order to characterize a whole social order after World War II until about 1980. And then they use the idea of a post-Fordist or post-industrial order to characterize contemporary U.S. society, sort of from 1980 till today, and they say these are like two very different regimes of accumulation, or two very different kinds of social order. And so I use that framework to look at what that meant, and I argue that workers entering the mill in the 1960s and early 1970s really entered a mill under this post-World War II industrial order, where they could, as Andrea was sort of pointing out, enter a mill and expect to work at Bethlehem Steel for their entire career, and really expect that they would have opportunities for mobility, for learning new skills, etc., within this one corporation as a unionized worker for their entire working life. They also could anticipate making what we call a male breadwinner wage, that the wages and benefits that unions had fought for through strikes all during the 1940s and 1950s, right? There were a number of strikes in those first 20 years that resulted in the higher wages and benefits of the early 1960s order when workers were coming into the mill. So that male breadwinner wage and good benefits, health care, pension, vacation, were part of that. That kind of security and stability and benefits gave workers the ability to plan what sociologist Richard Sennett calls a linear life narrative. They could enter the mill, they could expect to work their career there, they could expect to be able to retire, and that meant they could plan a future, right? They could put aside money to send their children to college. They could buy a house and take out a mortgage. They could plan for retirement, right? That all of that was built into that. And in addition, by the 1970s, the steel job was more secure. As those of you who work in steel know, layoffs are something that can be problematic and create insecurities for steel workers. But there were less layoffs. By 1973, there was a no strike clause in the steelworker contract as a part of the ENA. And with supplemental unemployment benefits, there were also more security for steel workers during layoffs. So all of those things led to, a much more stable, secure sort of plan for a career. The other thing that I argue is that sort of stability, security, and respect didn't happen just inside the mill. That this respect that was awarded their work was embedded in this broader social order, a sort of Fordist social order. Antonio Gramsci, Italian social scientist, wrote a great article about Fordism where he said, we have to understand this whole social order as much more than just work. It incorporates a quote, mode of living and of thinking and feeling life. And this was true in the broader society. Bethlehem was really a central place, right? This was the headquarters of Bethlehem Steel. Bethlehem Steel was a gigantic multinational corporation. Bethlehemites and Bethlehem Steel workers knew of the importance of Bethlehem Steel during World War II and in, the booming U.S. economy of the 1960s. And they brought those things together and really saw the importance of Bethlehem Steel in U.S. economic power, but also in U.S. geopolitical power and sort of the hegemony of the United States as well. And so, they saw steel as a core material for building the post-war U.S., the bridges, the skyscrapers, they saw their union as a very important political player that had an enormous amount of influence on national level politics and what presidential candidates would be elected. They felt that they had political power directly through their union. I sometimes tell my students, steelworkers in Bethlehem are not afraid to call their local politician. And I ask my student, how many of you would pick up the phone and call a local politician? And they don't even know who the local politicians are. So that kind of empowerment, right, that came from really feeling this political voice was also a part of that. And they felt that the wages they earned, their union wages as a steel worker, were wages that were well earned within the entire structure of U.S. society. They really felt that the male breadwinner wage was a legitimate wage. They should be paid enough to support a family, and society recognized that. That their role in this post-war order as consumers, buying houses and cars and washing machines and dryers, was really what led to the productivity of the US economy. And their important role in producing goods, in producing the steel that was building the country, was central. So both inside the job and outside the job, you know, this, what I argue is that this post-World War II sort of industrial order was very different than the contemporary post-industrial way that, you know, society is ordered. So, you know, in my book I talk about exclusions from sort of entry to what some might characterize as a more privileged sector of the working class, steel workers with strong unions, good wages, and benefits. And I think it's important to pay attention to those exclusions. I'm not really going to talk about these here, but I talk about them in my book because you know, not everyone was able to access those jobs. Women, for example, were only able to access those benefits through their husbands during this period. African American and Latino workers had more difficulty accessing those jobs. And even in Bethlehem, we see how up-homers, right, migrants from the coal countries sometimes also ran into some kinds of discrimination within the plant. And it's important to pay attention to those, which we're not going to pay so much attention to it right now, because some people would argue that those very fragmentations and exclusions contributed to some of the difficulties in resisting these processes of deindustrialization and created kind of the new class system we see today. And if you haven't read it, Gabriel Winant has an excellent book called The Next Shift, in which he looks at exactly that in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He looks at steel and then healthcare, right? The shift in Pittsburgh, and how does the working class change, and how is that related to some of the exclusions within the industrial working class in the Fordist order. So then I go on in the book, and one thing that I argue is that, you know, dominant ideology would often tell us that this is just natural and inevitable. Deindustrialization just happens because that's part of progress, right? Yes, manufacturing moves to other places, but then we develop Silicon Valley, and that's just the way economies work. And you know, one thing I want to show in the book is there's nothing natural and inevitable about these processes. There's all kinds of players involved, and including the state. And it's not predictable. I mean, one thing we often hear in dominant ideology also is, so, you know, steel workers or other industrial workers should sort of know that this is going to happen, right? This is just progress, it's deindustrialization, manufacturing just isn't cutting it anymore. They should be really aware of this and plan ahead, right? You know, in the book I also argue about that. I say that, in fact, it's very difficult in this very long process, 30-year process in Bethlehem at the steel mill, for steel workers to be able to predict what will happen, because in fact it's highly contradictory and confusing, and we'll look at that a little bit briefly. It's making it very hard for workers to plan strategies of how to move themselves and their families through that. But also I'm going to argue that those Fordist benefits are really important to keep, because the new jobs, the new economy, the new post-industrial social order does not have those. So the value of those benefits is enormous, right? So those are arguments that I make. Oh, this is all when people enter the mill, and I look at that in the book. So I look at the sort of the moral economy of the mill is what I call it, but what are those things that are valued, are supported by the union in the mill? So I talk about concepts of seniority, of solidarity, of citizenship, and of really producing goods that are important for society. So one point that I want to make along this lines of sort of combating this ideology that steelworkers should have known and been able to figure out a way to move on from steel is just that the whole process of restructuring and ultimately closing the steel mill here in Bethlehem was an incredibly contradictory and confusing process. So on the one hand, there's this long history of disinvestment and downsizing that we can see here. And this makes Bethlehem quite different than the Monongahela Valley, for example, is that it literally was a 30-year process of closing this mill. And in Frank Bam's book, he asked steelworkers, when did you first know the mill here was in trouble? And he gets answers that are all the way from 1955 to 1995 when they closed the hot end, right? So it's just a wide array. And this just shows you it's a long thing, right? One steel worker I talked to, literally their first job was at Bethlehem Steel's fabricated steel construction shop. They started and they were laid off within a year and a half, right? So you can just see the closing of alloy and tool steel, the early 1980s layoffs, recessions, and of course the US steel closures that were going on. A lot of that last cohort that I referred to, 78, 79, many of those people were laid off in the early 1980s. Some managed to stay. And that's interesting. That has to do with the story of women in steel, because a lot of women came in that last hiring, and last hired, first fired. They were, laid off in the early 1980s with the steel recession. First concessionary contract in 1983. Loss of jobs for modernization. These are just some examples. So this looks like sort of a steady move towards disinvestment and downsizing, but a very long one. But just to complicate things, at the same time, there was an enormous amount of investment going on in this very plant. So lest we think this is just a move towards disinvestment and downsizing, there are enormously contradictory messages being sent to steelworkers working in the plant. There's a $50 million upgrade of the gray mill in 1988. There was a $60 million upgrade of the coke works. Do you remember what year that was done? There was, you can talk, NMIH had a panel of coke works workers at last steel weekend. And you can talk to coke works people. They were shocked when Bethlehem Steel closed the coke works because there had been massive investment into the coke works, and they were assured it was going to continue for at least 10 years. And then at the end here I have, not everybody knows about all of these proposed mergers and buyouts that would have kept parts of the plant working, right? A proposed merger with British Steel in 1991 that failed. And all of these mergers and buyouts, steel workers are sitting there looking at these and going, like, if this goes through, this is going to save X number of jobs, right? 1993 agreement to install the continuous caster, which failed. Bethlehem Steel management backed out of that, much to the ire of the union. I talked to a union representative who literally hurled his chair across the room when he got that news from management. And in 1994, Noble Ventures buyout, which was also a failure. So you see all of these investments happening at the same time as disinvestment. Then of course we have, closing the plant, right? So in 1995, the last cast, the hot end closes, blast furnaces are shut down. In 1998, the last shops close, coke works, steam, air, water. 2001 to 2003, Bethlehem Steel enters the bankruptcy courts, emerges in 2003 to the International Steel Group purchase, and then we know middle purchase ISG, middle merge with Arcelor, Cleveland Cliffs purchases middle, right? So this is playing itself out across those mills that once were part of Bethlehem Steel, but after 2003 no longer are. Okay, so during this whole process, all kinds of things were going on inside the mill as well as outside of the mill. So I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I do want to look at a couple of those. So, you know, there's all of this restructuring and downsizing that's going on inside the mill. So there's all kinds of management, employee team initiatives in the plant. People who worked in the mill will remember, you know, the Duran trainings, Partners for Progress, working leaders, merging of crafts, right? Those are all different things that management did to attempt to increase productivity within the plant. There's closings of shops, departments, and divisions. We said the plant shut down. And then people are, there's a famous last cast photograph from the morning call. People are working, workers are working to attempt to really hold on to Fortis benefits in this process. So as I said before, like this dominant ideology idea that people should just get with the picture, move on, move into new kinds of jobs is not at all realistic. These are hugely important benefits that come with the steel job, and so workers had to strategize to attempt to hold on to those benefits. So pensions, that's a huge benefit, a defined benefit pension. They could range from $1,000 to $4,000 a month for the rest of a steelworker's life. That's hugely significant. Healthcare benefits, we all know how expensive it is to get healthcare in the United States today, an incredibly important benefit. So workers, you know, tried to hang on to these benefits in all kinds of different ways, and their unions worked with them to try to hang on to those benefits. So one way so some workers took early retirements, right? So with downsizing, the union and the company worked together to try to present early retirements to workers so that younger workers could continue to work at the mill and work towards getting their pensions, and offered early retirements with a $400 monthly supplemental benefit to pad the pension until workers were eligible for Social Security. So lots of workers opted to take that. Another option for workers was internal transfers. And for those of you who worked in the plant towards the end, you'll know that a lot of internal transfers, a lot of people ended up in the coke works at the very end of this plant's life because they were transferring internally to try to work towards their pension. And the coke works didn't close until 1998. That's an interesting thing to look at also, because the coke works sort of in the 1960s and 1970s was a heavily Latino department and until the consent decree of 1974, when people got plant seniority rights. You know, promotional tracks were tied to the department that you were hired in, and therefore, like, people hired into the coke works, which were many Latino workers, would work their whole career in the coke works. So it's kind of interesting that at the end, all of these white workers from around the mill were transferring into the coke works, right, to maintain their work and maintain their eligibility for pension. And so many workers I talked to who were white, who had transferred into the coke works, just talked to me about the respect that they developed for their fellow Latino coke workers who were like so skilled and knowledgeable in working with those batteries. The other thing workers did, and some of it, you know, a lot of us have heard about this living in and around Bethlehem, but it's not a story that's as frequently told, is that the union had negotiated external transfer rights, right? So workers whose department or shop was being shut down, who were not yet eligible for their pension, could request, or not even request, had to accept a transfer if they got a transfer letter in the mail within a 2-year period, right? And that would allow them to continue to work at another Bethlehem steel mill, to continue to put their time in towards their pension, right? Either the rule of 65, or there are these complicated rules for how you get your pension. So those external transfers became very important to people. And it was a way to hold on to their benefits. And at various times, there were different steel mills that Bethlehem Steel owned that workers could transfer into, could be forced to transfer into. Workers could also opt for a voluntary transfer, and some did. There were some workers who asked to be transferred to Burns Harbor in Indiana because that was Bethlehem Steel's newest mill, and some of them calculated that if they went there, that mill would continue to work and have work for a long time. Most workers didn't ask for a voluntary transfer. Instead, they took one of these union negotiated external transfers, which were within a certain radius, right? So those mills included Sparrows Point in Baltimore, Lackawanna up by Buffalo, Steelton out by Harrisburg, and in 1997, Bethlehem Steel bought Lucan Steel Company, which had Steelworks in Conshohocken and Coatesville. But this whole process of transfer was also very uneven. I mentioned seniority before. In sort of the union rules within the plant, seniority is highly valued, right? It's a valuable way of measuring people's skills and experience, and it gives workers certain statuses and privileges within the plant. But in this transfer process, seniority didn't always play itself out very smoothly because shops and divisions could close, but transfer options would vary, right? Your shop might close, and Bethlehem Steel hasn't bought Lucan's, which has 2 steel mills that are much more commutable, much closer to you than Sparrows Point or Lackawanna, right? So those rules because of this, uneven process, kind of those rules of seniority weren't always clear, and they weren't always working in this transfer process, and so it seemed a little unfair sometimes. In addition, workers worked really hard to get information about the plants that they were transferring into so they could make informed decisions about where to transfer to. They wanted to know the condition of the plant. Would the plant close before they were eligible for their transfer? Could be a good thing if they get their pension through second shutdown. Could be a bad thing if it closes and they're not eligible for pension money. Would they experience layoffs? How long was the commute? All of these things were variables, but they didn't have the same kind of information that Bethlehem Steel management had about the plants they were transferring into. So they tried to get information by visiting the plants from other steel workers, but that information was not great. It's difficult to make a good decision on that kind of limited information. And so then when they made this decision and transferred to some of these plants, this just shows you, sort of the transfer area. So they might be going to Harrisburg, which is going to be maybe an hour-and-a-half commute to the Steelton plant, or they could be going to Baltimore, which is going to be like a 3.5-hour drive, or to Lackawanna up in Buffalo, which is an even further drive. And so wherever they end up, it was very, very difficult for families. They transferred to these plants, but it was hard on families and it was hard on workers. Workers, when they transferred to another plant, initially lost their plant seniority. So that meant in terms of job assignments, vacation time, prestige in the new mill. They lost some of that hard-earned seniority at the Bethlehem plant. They transferred into new plants where they weren't natives. Now they were seen as the outsiders who were potentially taking jobs away from the children and relative of the home plant workers. They didn't have long lineages of steel work in Baltimore or Lackawanna like they did here in Bethlehem. And many workers really saw themselves in these new plants as doing their time to get their pension. So sort of steel work became more instrumental and less fulfilling, right, in the new plants. In addition, transfers were just very, very hard on families. And this runs really counter to sort of post-industrial ideas about families and flexibility and two-parent working families and being able to live in different places and be flexible and follow the job. For steelworking families, there's just tremendous amounts of support in the communities in terms of extended family and daycare and economic support, and that gets lost when people move. If these long commutes to Baltimore or Lackawanna, most steelworkers, whole families didn't move. The steel worker would move and have a roommate and stay there and commute back on weekends. But they found that very, very hard. They found it put a lot of strain on families. Fathers felt like they couldn't properly parent children who were often teenagers and in high school, who they felt needed sort of the father's presence in the household. Living with other steel workers often led to problems in Baltimore and Buffalo. A lot of divorces happened. It's the kind of intimate violence of these forced transfers that workers had to do to hold on to these benefits, but that were just so difficult, that really ripped a lot of families apart and were very, very difficult for workers. So I looked at that, but it was very important for workers, not only monetarily, super important monetarily to get their pensions, but it was also very important to them because workers had earned their defined benefit pensions. I mean, they looked at the pensions very much as something that was a hard-earned right? They had earned it as security in return for working on incredibly dangerous jobs. They had earned it through deferred wages, right? They collectively bargained these pensions, often in lieu of wage increases, right? And they had earned it as sort of payments for depreciation. The wear and tear on the body that comes through steelwork. Every steelworker I know has problems hearing, problems with their knees, problems with their backs, right? That's part of what a pension is. It's kind of a payment for the depreciation of this kind of very difficult work that goes on in the mill. So workers are making all of the, using all of these strategies to try to get their pension. But ironically, the best laid plans often went awry, right? Didn't work because ultimately, Bethlehem Steel entered the bankruptcy court in 2001. This is something that was just shocking to so many people, was Bethlehem Steel entering the bankruptcy court. I don't think I talked to a single steel worker who predicted the bankruptcy. Like every steel worker said, yes, at some point, yes, I could see what was happening to the plant. Nobody that I talked to predicted the bankruptcy of this entire corporation, right? And so it was an incredible shock. And even when they were told about the possibility of bankruptcy, this guy, I think I made up a name, from Manny Vega, who was still working at Sparrows Point at the time, said management at Sparrows Point came and talked to all the Bethlehem workers that were working there about Bethlehem Steel going into the bankruptcy court. And he said that management laid it out as, this is bankruptcy. This is a bankruptcy process. Corporations go through it. It's really, think of it as like a cure for an ailing corporation. They go in one side, they get the corporation fixed up, they come out the other side, right? And so that's what Manny Vega said. That's what I was told, but little did I know that it was, we thought it was like the company going into the hospital, go in, get fixed up, come out, but they didn't tell us. You come out on the other side of the door where they put you in a coffin, right? And he's exactly right about that. Bethlehem Steel came out the other side of that bankruptcy process, bought by International Steel Group. But the only reason that Bethlehem Steel became a company that was desirable to Wilbur Ross, who's known as a vulture investor and later became the Commerce Secretary for Donald Trump, is that the bankruptcy court actually is a technique to rinse out legacy costs, to get rid of legacy costs that Steve Miller, the CEO who walked Bethlehem Steel through this, said we're just too onerous for the corporation. These expensive legacy costs are weighing us down. In his autobiography that he wrote, Steve Miller said, you know, when we were like giving out all these pensions, we just didn't expect steelworkers to live that long. So in the bankruptcy court, what steelworkers found is that the court itself prioritizes certain interests. So the bankruptcy court is not the court of, labor, right? It's a bankruptcy court, and there's certain states that are experts in bankruptcy court. Delaware being one of them, which I believe is where Bethlehem Steel took its bankruptcy case. So the bankruptcy process prioritizes the interests of financiers. If a corporation goes into bankruptcy, immediately it goes to financing institutions and gets out big loans to help restructure the corporation. Those loans are protected by the bankruptcy court. They have to be repaid with interest. So the financiers are making a lot of money off of bankruptcy. Upper level managers who the bankruptcy court decides are doing the onerous and difficult work of walking the corporation through bankruptcy also get special incentive pay. Something I think most steelworkers would be quite frustrated by, right? They're getting extra pay to walk Bethlehem Steel into its death. And of course, all the bankruptcy lawyers are making a lot of money in the process, but in the bankruptcy court, workers' contracts are not prioritized. Workers' interests are not given priority. They're not seen as important stakeholders. So bankruptcy court laws trump labor laws. And steelworkers found that out during the bankruptcy process. And so what happened in bankruptcy was sort of the decimation of these assets that steelworkers had collectively bargained for and had worked for and had earned, right? The wiping them out. So luckily under ERISA, there is a public-private entity, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, that took over the pensions. And so that means that they take over Bethlehem Steel's pensions, and then they're responsible for being in charge of those and giving pensions out to workers. So workers were covered by the PBGC, which was a good thing, and was a part of union-driven legislation, ERISA, in the 1970s that created the PBGC. But nonetheless, when the PBGC had to take over the Bethlehem pension early, so this process of bankruptcy went on from 2001 to 2003. The PBGC had to step in suddenly and early because they found out that Bethlehem Steel had this plan to retire all these senior workers, thereby making the labor force even cheaper for International Steel Group when they took it over. But those retirements, those pensions, would have added an additional $500 million to $1 billion onto the pension benefit guarantee claims that PBGC had to cover. At that time, Bethlehem Steel's pension program was the largest pension ever to come to the PBGC at that time. But even with the PBGC covering the pension, workers lost a lot when their pensions got taken over. They lost their early retirement benefit that Bethlehem Steel had guaranteed to them. That was the additional $400 month. PBGC had caps that were much more onerous for younger workers than older workers. So younger workers often found their pension benefits, decreased because of those caps. And Bethlehem Steel had promised to increase pensions in the period 2000 to 2004, and PBGC did not recognize those promises. So many workers still had their pensions covered, but only if they were pension eligible, right? If we go back to transfers for a second, there are people who transferred the minute the PBGC takes over those pension benefits. If they're not pension eligible, they are not eligible for their pension. There was a steelworker at Sparrows Point was literally 8 days away from his pension when the PBGC did that takeover, and so his pension was just not there for him. So these cuts could be as much as 40 to 50% a month. in workers' pension payments. So that had a huge impact on workers. So, you know, it's like the bankruptcy, you know, the corporation is describing legacy costs as onerous. They're being defined by executives like Steve Miller as drags on the Bethlehem Steel Company and as losing shareholder value, and that these union workers with their big pensions are cutting into shareholder value. But I just want us to reflect for a minute on the recent United Auto Workers strike, in which the new UAW president, Shawn Fain, reminded the entire country that the real drains on shareholder value are the tremendous salaries that CEOs are making, not the increases that he was fighting to get for UAW workers. And I thought it was very interesting that a court in Delaware recently decided that Elon Musk's $56 billion in Tesla stock options, which are part of his salary as CEO, was an egregious had an egregiously negative impact on shareholder value, right? So, okay, the last thing I'll talk about is healthcare costs. So also in the bankruptcy process, steel workers lost their healthcare, and there was no substitute for that, right? So the bankruptcy court just wiped out healthcare for steel workers. And I talked to a union worker who had been in the union hall after that bankruptcy, and he said that he described older retirees living in and around the valley. And remember, there are like 20,000 workers and their dependents who were depending on those retiree health care benefits in this area. He described older retirees coming into the union hall, showing up with medical bills and saying, why am I getting this medical bill? And he had to tell these people, you lost your health care in Bethlehem Steel's bankruptcy. This is what happened. The courts took it away from you, right? So Bethlehem Steel entered the bankruptcy court with $3 billion in healthcare obligations. So when we think about like the total money of this, you can see how stripping these workers' assets makes the corporation a very appealing purchase for Wilbur Ross, right? Lost all those, expenses he would have. He's also sort of disciplined workers through this whole process. So when Wilbur Ross negotiates with workers at these plants, he can get more flexible kinds of work setups because they've been disciplined by this whole bankruptcy process. And he's able to just snap up Bethlehem Steel Corporation after the bankruptcy. And he holds on to it for 1.5 years and sells it to Mittal for a $267 million profit. Profit to who? Profit to Wilbur Ross, right? One scholar, Eileen Applebaum, showed that Ross's profits, that $267 million, almost exactly equal the losses sustained in the pension and healthcare programs for retirees, right? So this is what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession. Here you're like predatorially using the bankruptcy court system to take workers' assets and move them over to Wilbur Ross, right? Another scholar, Thomas O'Hagan, makes the point that this erasure of pension and healthcare benefits, quote, did more than any wage cut to increase inequality in the United States. I mean, this isn't just happening to steel workers. We can look at the contemporary post-industrial economy and we will be hard-pressed to find a defined pension benefit and to find health care coverage that we're not helping to pay into, right? So it's just a gigantic transfer of wealth. And the last thing I'll say is that, another thing that does is that bankruptcy propels workers back into the labor force. I talked to so many steel workers who were happy to retire or maybe do a part-time job. They had their pension, they had their health care, the bankruptcy comes through, and now they have to find a job with health care, They need more money coming in. Their pension isn't enough for them. So you're propelling workers into this new economy that I look at in one chapter in the book, in which those jobs are lower wage jobs without the kind of benefits they had before, but it doesn't matter, right? They need those jobs. So it's a way of pushing them into this new economy. And again, in a very uneven way. Some workers had healthcare through their spouse, right? So it plays itself out very unevenly. I go on to look at the new economy and do all of those things, but I just want to raise some questions, and you can look at the book and read about it, but to me it was very interesting, the kinds of questions that steel workers raised as they reflect on this long period that they've gone through. Right? And one thing that they asked, because I think these are questions we should all be thinking about, right? One thing steel workers asked was, what will happen to U.S. society if we are a society that doesn't have meaningful production of goods, right? Is it good to have a society in which our whole economy is services and finance? Can the U.S. economy, is that good? Can we remain strong that way? And is it, like on a philosophical question, is that a good society, right? Can the U.S. economy remain strong without a working class that can afford to purchase goods, right? Is part of not having a working class that's middle class that can afford to purchase those consumption art, has that kind of pushed us into the Walmart, dollar store, retail controlled logistics and warehouse economy, where we have to buy all these products cheaper from China or Bangladesh and move them through this country because American workers can't afford to purchase products anymore. Is U.S. society, is it a good or most developed society without a robust middle class? I can't tell you the number of steel workers who asked me that question in thinking about the contemporary United States. Are all of these people working as hedge fund managers in private equity firms, running casinos? Is that creating a good society? And are they really, should they be making all of this money? That's another question I heard. And sort of on a greater level, like, what is useful work? What is work that is good for the U.S. economy and society? What makes work meaningful? What makes work fulfilling? Are we creating jobs in the U.S. where people can find meaning and fulfillment in their work? Or is that also an enormous problem in the contemporary Lehigh Valley? So I guess I just want to leave you with those thoughts, because those are questions that steel workers raised as they thought about this sort of new society and new economy in Bethlehem. Okay, so Andrea, do we want to have questions? Yes, we do.
How large was the workforce at its peak in the Lehigh Valley for steel?
In World War II was the largest. It was a little over 30,000 workers, I think. I've read different statistics, but I say between 30 and 31,000 workers. So you can imagine, in a city the size of Bethlehem, to get 30,000 workers, you're pulling workers in from a very wide area. And the workforce was incredibly diverse, because by the time workers started in 1962, 63, I'd say 16,000 workers, right? So it's a gigantic, vertically integrated steel mill. I say to my students, we look at big, huge auto factories, do we see factories that size in the U.S. today? And they say, no. Where do we see them? We can go to China. We can look at Foxconn, and we can have these gigantic factories employing literally thousands and thousands of workers, right?
Throughout your book, you use this new word to me, Fordist.
Yes.
Where does this come from?
So that's a social science term, and it comes out of this idea that Henry Ford sort of created this new kind of industrial society where you had assembly line production that allowed you to produce all these goods cheaply with de-skilled labor using the assembly line. And so he produced a Model T, which was an affordable car. But then also Ford started paying its workers more, the famous $5 a day, because he said, if I want consumers who can buy the Model T, I'm gonna have to pay a higher salary. So like post-World War II, you know, when the US government sort of went with the economist Keynes to a model where we didn't want another depression, we wanted to keep putting government contracts into the economy anytime there was it was around this idea that, yeah, you needed, you know, you wanted sort of a contract between unions, corporations, the government, so that workers could earn enough salary that they could consume a middle-class lifestyle, that was good for the economy. The thing about Fordism that doesn't fit very well with steel is, like, an auto assembly plant is not a steel mill, right? And so the de-skilling on the assembly line isn't the same as the steel mill, where there's so many skilled workers and so much teamwork, not as individualized work, right? People are working in crews, so, yeah.
Jill, do you know the way you've described the shift in the economy in the post-industrial period in the U.S.? Do you know if productivity has continued to go up as it had during the 70s and prior to that for the economy in general?
The U.S. economy is quite productive. I just saw in the business section yesterday a statistic on worker productivity. I don't know if it's as productive, like as the boom years of, let's say, the 1960s, but it's a very productive economy where we're producing tons and tons of gross national product, right? But you know, whenever you look at charts, the increase in median worker wages versus productivity is going up, workers' wages are not going up. So what happens to all that profit? Well, we see like hugely increased inequality, right? Yeah.
Can I add to that? One of the statistics that Bethlehem Steel would publish every year was man hours per ton for your plant and for the whole corporation, and then for comparing it to the nation as a whole. Consistently, that went down over the years. When it got to 1, they changed the concept to tons per man hour. And then it started to go up. And the thing that tripped that over was the mini mills, because the mini mills could make one hell of a lot more tons per man hour than any of the integrated mills. So consistently over the whole year she's talking about, and up till today even, it's taking less and less man hours to make a basic ton of steel. Now that's raw steel. That's not converting that steel into any useful product.
Now, it would be interesting to look at the mini mills, which we don't have time to do now, because that's something that social scientists document in the United States of really government policy encouraging corporations to move to Sunbelt states. But those Sunbelt states are what we call right-to-work states, which don't have the same kinds of union protections in them. So mini mills really started taking off in right-to-work states where they could work with non-unionized labor. And like, we don't have time to go into it, but the role of the state in all of this is really very, very important. We sometimes like to think of our corporations as operating like totally on their own in this free market. That, if you look at steel, that has never happened with steel, right? The role of the state, of government contracts during war and outside of war, is just central to understanding the steel industry.
So I have multiple generations of people that work in the steel company. So thank you for your research, because it's spot on with the culture of my family.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear
My
that.
grandfather tried to enlist in World War II and was denied because he worked here and was told, you're more important here, go make your steel. My father worked, he was hired in 72 or 73, at that point, and he actually worked for the Steel Cokeworks, so he was last out, met the rule of 80, so,
Right.
25 years plus 55, he retired at 80. And we were really hit hard when the pension went away and the health insurance went away, and yeah, I mean, everything that you've said, I mean, it's like, I'm like, oh yeah, that's my family.
Yeah, and just the examples you give, being told this job is so important.
Yeah.
You can't go to work. We need you here. This is the center of the effort for World War II. And then a generation later,
Yeah.
sorry, we're taking away all your
I
benefits.
can hear my dad. I was in high school and he said, "You are going to college. Period. The end all. There is no more steel." And that was, I graduated high school in '88. So did he foresee it? No, I don't think he did. But I think he was smart enough to know things are going to change. And this is not a multi-generational company anymore.
Yeah.
On the pensions, they got some money with the PBGC, but it was reduced though, wasn't it?
Absolutely a lot.
I don't know what
Yeah.
percentage it was.
So it was reduced. They had a $400 per month supplemental for early retirement. That was wiped out right away. And then it depended on the worker, how much their pension was reduced. But like just the insult added to injury was some steel workers had their pension reduced, and through the PBGC calculations, and they'd been getting their normal pension, and then they got a letter like a year later from the PBGC, you owe us X amount of money because we've been paying you the wrong amount. And it's just like, really? It's just on top of everything. What?
Or their spouse, something like that.
Or their spouse, yeah.
And the PBGC, that's a U.S. government thing, like the FDIC
It's like
or
a
something?
public-private entity, like many entities are. So it's set up under the government, but it has autonomy. So it's sort of like Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae.
Oh,
It's
okay.
kind of like that, yeah. And it's set up to insure these pension plans, and so they've had to pick up a lot. They had to pick up a lot of airline pensions for a while with those airline bankruptcies, and the pilots were hard hit because they're higher salaried. So they often their pensions, weren't the same because they had much higher pensions than steelworkers. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear the steelworkers asking the same questions that were asked in Athens 3,000 years ago when Pericles was running a place where they considered this was our golden age, and he said, there's two things we got to watch. Athens should not have people that are too poor, and Athens should not have people that are too rich. Not if you want a democracy and a flourishing society. I think the only upside of this situation is that we're starting to have that conversation publicly finally, where for the longest time, the most people would talk about economic justice was the simple question, should my taxes go up or not? That was the only question. No public discussion of, as you said in your talk, how should we live together? Is it just about making money, or do we want families and lives and a middle class and meaningful work? That, that's got to be part of the discussion, instead of making celebrities out of someone because they are among the handful of multi-billionaires that could buy Brazil if they want.
Yeah. And I mean, meaningful work at all different levels. David
Yes.
Graeber, an anthropologist who unfortunately died recently, wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs,
Yeah.
which was essentially looking, he had people like emailing him from all over the world going, I'm a lawyer and I hate my job. I'm a doctor, I can't still.
Yeah.
It's just sort of the de-skilling and dehumanization
Yes.
of so many different kinds of work that is kind of presaged by here, what's going on at the steel mill. Okay. Bill?
I just, in response to that, one of the things in your book that I found most engaging was your description of how steelworkers who might be on a holiday working would put together like a community meal at the plant. I mean, could you talk a little bit about some of the ways that steelworkers were able to create a social entity within their team?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter where I talk about the moral economy of the mill,
which is just, it was so fascinating to me to hear from workers. But one thing I argue is that workers felt a very strong sense of citizenship to the space of the mill. Like, they didn't think of it like, it was their mill. And that's for a number of different reasons. A lot of these steel workers had long lineages of steel work, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, fathers who worked in this mill. They had grown up talking about steel their entire lives. This is what Jack Metzger calls metal sense. It's just like the knowledge of steel at home, at the job, in the community, right? But they also built a lot of the things at the plant. The riggers built tons of buildings out of this plant. So they were built by steel workers, and they used the plant spaces in all kinds of interesting ways. So one thing I talk about is cooking, because like any steel worker will tell you, they work swing shifts. So if they're on middle or night shift, workers are jerry-rigging hot plates and cooking all sorts of meals in the plant. And they're also doing all kinds of things in the spaces. They had gardens out by East Lehigh. They, had orchards. So they were very knowledgeable. And the machinery was so old. I think steel workers felt a lot of ownership of machinery within the plant because their knowledge, they're the only ones that could run it, right? So yeah, so I talk about this feeling of ownership, of citizenship that workers aren't supposed to feel, right? That's the property of capital, sort of, right? But no, not in this case so much, yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk, Jill. One of the things that's really powerful for me about the story you've told today and that you tell in the book is reminding us all that what management so often pretended was a technical or economic story, that this was inevitable, was really, in the end, it's a political story. It's a question about what we value as a society in all the ways you've talked about. The question I wanted to ask, actually, before I ask my question, one other observation along those same lines, because I've been writing a lot about the early history of the steel plant, and part of what's so devastating about this story is that what steelworkers and what the union fought so hard to achieve was an attempt to correct a century of behavior on the part of management toward workers in the earlier history of the Bethlehem Steel, which at some level then we as a society allowed to repeat itself. So many of these devastating effects of the end of the steel experience were repetitions of what had happened earlier. But the question I want to ask is, because the steelworkers themselves and because the Steelworkers Union achieved this extraordinary thing during that, now we can see it's a relatively brief period, this age of prosperity between the war and the 80s. I'm curious what the steelworkers you talked to, whether people had thoughts about what politically steelworkers could have done. In other words, did people with hindsight, having watched all this play out, did people have thoughts about how we could organize differently to prevent this story of the sort of theft of benefits that workers have created through their work?
I don't think steelworkers have a good sense of that, because in part, I think steelworkers are very, very supportive of their union, because the union accomplished so much for steelworkers. I think that there are a lot of things that went wrong, and part of it is, in part, the way business unionism developed. Creating sort of a protected class of workers and leaving a large group out of that. Maybe being too willing to try to come up with solutions with management. At the end of this plant, the union leaders will be very straightforward and honest that all they were trying to do was stretch out time for people and get their pensions. I think the union leaders here at this plant didn't see any way that they could stop this process of deindustrialization at this point. I think one of the reasons for that is they saw what had happened in the Monongahela Valley, where there was a very strong worker and community movement to reopen plants under community and worker ownership that ultimately failed because they couldn't get financing from big capital and the state was not supporting them, right? So that was like a lesson learned, I think, for the union here. That was a very harsh lesson. I also think that steel companies learned a lot from the close downs in Youngstown and Monongahela. They did not want to see that kind of community organizing in opposition to plant close downs. And I think they switched their strategy to having a longer close down. And you know, a longer close down means also like really contradictory messages being sent to steelworkers, because like steelworkers in Frank's book, 3 different workers, I think, you know, went somewhere like Shawnee ski thing and ran into an outside contractor. They go, oh, what are you doing here? Oh, I'm going to the Bethlehem Steel plant. They want me to put in a bid on this equipment that's still running, right? And the worker's like, wait a minute. So management is bringing in these potential buyers at the same time as they're telling workers we're not closing down. But that strategy of drawing it out also prevents this kind of, and it switches unions to thinking more about how do I get these individual pensions? How can I get as many, which they should want to do, of course, individual workers' pensions as I can, instead of like, how can we stop this entire process? You know.
Which drug out a lot longer than I, for one, anticipated.
And there are real benefits to that. I'm not, you know, people getting their pensions is incredibly, incredibly important.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.